We are living through the dual crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change driven by the unsustainable use of our planet's resources. These are interlinked emergencies. And there's a saying that the biodiversity loss is a consequence of other environmental problems. So, do you see any impact of climate change on biodiversity?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely true that these two crises are inextricably linked. So climate change affects biodiversity, biodiversity affects climate change. So we already see in Beijing, for example, some bird species that traditionally have a more southern distribution are starting to move north. So in recent years, a few species that used to be very, very rare in Beijing have now become more common. They're expanding their range north.
But is that a good thing? I mean, I get it, it's probably because of global warming, which is not good. But for Beijing people, they can see more bird species. So overall, is that a good thing?
It's a good question. I think obviously there are some positives if some bird species are expanding. But I think overall, the picture is quite negative because birds, for example, that like colder climate, if they are breeding on mountaintops, for example, if the warmth gradually moves up the mountain and the trees gradually move up the mountain, they're going to run out of space. They have nowhere to go once they get to the top of the mountain.
Yes, of course. A bird that you may say is not harmful for anyone, but a bird that used to live in 1,000 meters above the sea level, and now, because of climate change, the temperature is rising a little bit, they can come to another ecosystem where they do not have a predator, and they invade this ecosystem and kill some other birds to take the food, etc. So those very complex changes in ecosystem equilibrium are being seen in our country the last years with insects, with birds, with some diseases for more bigger animals like mammals, etc. We have seen these threats in the latest years. It's a shame.
Yes, we all have experienced some of the extreme impacts of overheating, drought, extreme flooding, and changes. That also puts a lot of pressure on the vegetation, changes in vegetation.
It changes a lot of things. In oceans, it changes the coral reefs that are the basis.
And of course, a healthy environment, healthy biodiversity helps to increase climate resilience to climate change. So things like mangrove forests really help protect our coasts. Healthy coral reef also really helps to protect our coasts. And so if we lose those, then we increase the risk to human communities, particularly on coasts.
In fact, some of the predictions for the future, 50 years from now, are quite dire in terms of how few coral reefs would survive the additional heat impact. So if we also deplete many of the wildlife communities in the ocean, the ecosystems are otherwise compromised, these reefs will not have an ability to be resilient to the additional threat of additional heating from the climate and the ocean. That's just one example. We have other examples with deforestation. For example, in Gabon, already, while they have a very healthy forest with the large Congo rainforest and the biggest population of forest elephants, the scientific studies already show that many of the trees are less productive in terms of the food they produce, and that it's already affecting elephant population health. So these kind of things are going to start to become more of a threat to wildlife.
Yes. The main impact of deforestation is related to climate change, basically, but also to the ecosystem, the protection of the water, the fresh water that can flow if you have a forest that captures the rainwater and then drain it through the rivers. And if you have deforestation, you will have landslides and some other effects harmful to the environment. And you can also affect the nests from the birds, the habitats of mammals, reptiles, etc.
If we only look back in the rearview mirror, There have been some recent studies that came out in the last few months, in the last year, showing something like 70% of species have already had a massive impact from up until now. But as we look forward, climate will become more and more of an impact on top of the other threats I mentioned, from over consuming too many natural resources, like the impacts we then have on deforestation, on overfishing, depleting the marine ecosystems, and obviously the impact then on specific wildlife populations.
Thank you so much, everyone. Like you said, no environmental problem is isolated from the others. Mario, I know you've just participated in the UNEP conference on plastic pollution. Now, 14 million tons of plastic go into our ocean every year. How is it threatening biodiversity?
Yes, it's all correlated. All the plastic that have been produced from the last 60 or 70 years, just 9 or 10% has been recycled and reincorporated to the economy. But 91 or 90% of the plastic produced for the last 6 decades are in the environment. And the problem is that plastics were anthropogenic. They were created by men. So there are molecules that do not have a natural destroyer.
Yes, definitely. And we're just throwing it away, and it's going through the rivers into the oceans. And obviously, we can't just go clean it up. It's too much.
Some of them get affected by time, atmospheric conditions like the UV rays, etc., and they crack a little bit. But the small parts that rise from this crackling process are called microplastics. They are still really long life materials from hundreds of years.
That is even getting into the food chain, even getting into the tissues of the fish and mammals as well, turtles and whales.
And perhaps in the potabilization plants that takes water from the rivers, if the particles are really, really, really small, you will end up drinking it. So for several pathways, they end up in trophic chains from animals, including humans. And as they are anthropic, there is no really a way of biodegrading it. So they accumulate and they cause harm to these species. If all countries, all nations could manage it, as engineers say that's the right way to manage it and put it in landfills, there could be a controlled problem. But as this is not real for all the cities in the world, because low-income nations do not have this infrastructure, do not have this coverage of waste management, etc. So many plastics ended up in the soil. And then when it rains, the water flows and goes into the rivers, and the river flows and gives these loads of plastics to the ocean.
So we need to use less, of course, stop the bleeding and as the first stop. But how to clean these systems will be the next challenge, and not sure we'll be able to do a very good job there. And we need to do this together. So I hope we see some exciting announcements on the 30 by 30 commitment and other strong commitments to reducing our utilization of natural resources